Sorry about that technical difficulty. So basically 2 components to this talk. The first, I'm going to provide some select water quality data that we've been collecting for this year. And then the second is I'm going to propose the 4-point strategy, which was, as previously mentioned, includes short-term, interim, and long-term recommendations. Okay, so Marty already showed this slide, and it's sort of funny. This slide is essentially my career. I started as a consultant in the early 90s. Lake Hopatcong was one of the first lakes I was working on. Looking at from 1990 to 2000, and that red bar you see shows the average phosphorus concentration that we want to be at or less. So when we have average phosphorus concentrations of 0.03 or lower, for the most part we have good water quality, not a lot of algae. And each one of those points represent an average of 7 to 9 surface water sampling stations. And you can see that through the 90s, we had some pretty high phosphorus concentrations. I can also say that we have had algae blooms like this in Lake Hopatcong in the past. But in the past, they've been in select areas. This is the first time we've seen it where it was lake-wide. But you can see through the 90s, it was pretty erratic. 2000, when the commission was formed, and you look through the decades, from 2000 to 2010, phosphorus concentrations, for the most part, were below that 0.03 threshold. And I went to most of those meetings, and the biggest complaints we had during that decade were too many weeds. A lot of weeds. Well, it's because when you have clearer water, when you have less algae, you'll get more weeds. But you know what? Most lake communities would rather deal with weed management than algae management because of exactly what's going on now. So when you look through the 2000s, when the commission had money, when they had full-time staff cleaning out those catch basins with the municipalities, with the shared service agreements, when harvesting was going full tilt, and then about halfway through that decade, the commission received a number of grants that totaled over $2 million. 2 were from New Jersey DEP through the non-point source 319 program. 1 was from EPA, the Targeted Watershed Grant, and another EPA grant went through DEP to the Township of Jefferson, where they developed their septic management plan. So they got an infusion halfway through the decade of about $2 million, implemented a lot of projects, a lot of stormwater projects. Again, remember, those structures were being cleaned out by those shared service agreements. And then when you look toward the end of the decade, about 2008, when the recession hit, money was tight. And then when those grants were over, which was about 2015 when the last grant was completed, you can see what happened. Phosphorus concentrations started creeping up. We weren't continuing with the installation of the stormwater structures. We didn't have the staff doing the shared service agreements, cleaning out the catch basins, maintaining the stormwater infrastructure. You know, Jefferson was focused on their ordinance for their pump outs, which is great, but something that we need to discuss sometime in the future is possibly sewering. You know, there are some other things that were coming up on the horizon, and even before the situation occurred in June, the Lake Hopatcong Commission received a grant from the New Jersey Highlands Council to update the restoration plan. So the restoration plan was finalized in 2006. We realized it needed to be updated. So we actually started working on that last year. We're wrapping up that plan. But I did want to emphasize, this graph it's pretty telling, that it's showing that when you don't have money, phosphorus goes up. When you have money and you're implementing those projects and you're controlling the phosphorus goes down. You have clearer water quality, you have clearer water, better water, less algae. So I'm just going to talk about some of the data that's been collected to date. So this is, I mentioned each one of those points is an average of about 7 to 9 stations. This is showing all of the stations. And the one thing I want to identify is, if you look at the orange bar, which is June, almost every concentration was above 0.03. And this is what I said about we were we were concerned when we saw this, that concentrations around the lake were high, which, when you look at that long-term database, that last data point for 2019, the average concentration in June was above 0.04. That's the first time in the 21st century that the concentration of phosphorus went above 0.04. So that right there tells us more phosphorus, more algae. So again, going back to this, showing those phosphorus concentrations, I want to point out June had a lot of phosphorus. That's what triggered the bloom. That's one of the reasons why the bloom was found all around the lake, and it started all along the edge. We also saw this in a lot of other lakes in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. Every lake was hit with a very similar type of bloom. The other point I want to make is Station 10, look at that June concentration is the highest, that orange bar. That station is just below the quarry stream. I do want to identify that. That's the most northern station. It's down gradient of the stream where the quarry is off of. This is total phosphorus concentrations. Look at Station 10. Now, none of these are above the water quality limit, the DEP water quality limit for TSS, total suspended solids, but you can see Station 10 had the highest concentrations of all of those stations. In addition to doing the in-lake monitoring, as part of updating the restoration plan, we've done some select stormwater monitoring. So now instead of sampling in the lake, now I'm talking about samples collected from streams. And this is just showing we did 2 stormwater events in May. We did one in early July. D1 is that stream down gradient of the quarry. And that July concentration was very high. And the last water quality data I'm going to show you again, D1, this is total suspended solids. During the July event, we had high TSS concentrations from that stream down gradient of the quarry. So 2 things I want to identify. One is, we have to do a little more investigation, but it looks like, that stream is producing more phosphorus and TSS than the other sites going into the lake. But number 2, and this is more critical, that it's not just one location. It's all around the lake. We saw this by the elevated concentrations throughout the lake in June, and we also saw this by the fact that we had that green ring start. The bloom started as a near-shore bloom around the entire lake, not in just one area. So that is the water quality part. I'm now going to wrap up talking about the 4-point strategy. The 4-point strategy, so we have 4 components here. The first component is to complete the revision of the watershed implementation plan. This is a long-term goal. So the plan will be done in about a month or 2, but the implementation is going to take years because there's a large number of projects listed under that. I can tell you the first restoration plan was finalized in 2006. We've implemented a wide variety of projects based on that, but we needed to update the plan. So that's the long-term measure. The next 3 are short to intermediate term. Short term, I'm defining it as happening basically now, this year. Interim would be sometime within the next year. So it's hard to tease those apart because it really depends on funding and implementation. But if we look at those, the first is, identifying some near-shore demonstration projects. So it's key that, we've seen that this large-scale bloom started by elevated phosphorus concentrations coming into those near-shore areas and then blooming. What can we do? What sort of demonstration projects can we implement to reduce the phosphorus going into those near-shore areas? So the beaches, the bays, the coves, the homeowner association groups that are dealing with those blooms. Are there projects we can implement now and objectively evaluate to determine, is this something that's appropriate for other sites throughout the lake, or should we look at something else? The third point is beach and cove restoration plans. And this is something I sort of stole from New York State DEC. They've been pitching for their larger lakes that the beach and cove community should have their own little mini plans. that does two things. One is it gives ownership to the people who live and recreate in that area to say, okay, the whole watershed thing, we know that's important, we know we want to clear up the whole lake, but what can we do at our location? What projects either in the water or in our immediate drainage area for stormwater or septic can we do to improve conditions? So it gives them some empowerment on what they can do, number one, but number two, it also gives them responsibility to say, okay, you know what, you want to help, this is how you can pitch in to help the lake. It will help your little neck of the woods, but it will also help the lake in general as well. So those beach cove restoration plans, I think, are going to be very important. And then finally, you know, we've heard so many people bring up different ideas and concepts. Well, why don't you aerate the whole lake? Why don't you use alum? Why don't you dredge? If we're going to start asking questions like that, we really need to do some sort of scientific investigations. This is going to be really critical because I keep hearing people talking about mixing the whole lake. Aeration can be very important and it could be very valuable for some of the nearshore areas, but based on the models we have, the internal load coming from the sediments only accounts for about 7% of the lake's phosphorus load. About 80% of its load comes from septic and from stormwater. But that's based on a model that's pretty old, from the 80s. So one of the suggestions we're making is why don't we collect some empirical data, update the model, and actually quantify that internal load. Maybe it's larger now. I don't know, but without doing those scientific investigations, I can't say for sure. The other thing is the algae. Anytime we collect samples for algae, we're basically collecting them mid-lake and a net tow. Maybe we need to start collecting more discrete and a larger number of algae samples so that we can better predict when these blooms will occur. Do they occur in the open area as deep water blooms and come to the surface, or are they starting as these nearshore blooms, as the bloom that looked like that happened this year occurred? So those scientific investigations are very important. But again, for a 4-point strategy, the first component is the long term, and then the next 3 are those short-term to interim strategies. This is a very preliminary budget. Very preliminary budget. I have $3 million for the restoration plan. That's the long-term plan. That does not include any sort of septic or sewering. That's only identifying 26 large stormwater projects that we're recommending throughout the watershed. But again, keep in mind that we implemented about 12 different stormwater projects with the $2 million that was received a decade ago from both DEP and EPA. So we're looking at 26 stormwater projects for the long interim. Personally, I put this out there, having full-time staff that are really focused on weed harvesting, and this was previously mentioned, focusing on weed harvesting during the summer. Fall comes around, they winterize the equipment, then later in the fall and then into spring, they can do those catch basin cleanouts, and all those stormwater structures that we're saying being installed, they should be also responsible for the clean out of those structures as well, as a shared service agreement. That was very effective back in the 2000s in terms of removing the phosphorus and the solids. You know, doing that on a routine basis really helped to prevent those nutrients from going into the lake. I also have some budgets for a select group of beach restoration plans. Again, using some information from New York State DEC, some demonstration projects, and some specific scientific studies to answer some of the questions that have recently been raised. So in total, just for this budget that I have out there, it's $4 million. Now keep in mind that first one, that list of $3 million, a lot of that's going to be occurring over the long term. So I could see potential sources of funding coming in through grants or other sources of revenue. But really, that's a very preliminary budget. It does not include the weed harvesting. It does not include any conversations or studies associated with sewering feasibility or septic management. But this is something that, and I always emphasize this, everyone's job. It's the state, it's the towns, the counties, the communities, the people, the visitors. Everyone needs to pitch in for this to really be effective and go back to where people are complaining because the water's so clear and we're having to deal with aquatic plants and focusing on how to control and prevent them. So I think that is it. So close to making this smooth. And that is it. Thank you.